Hello, fellow book people. Today I'm talking about What It Is Like to Go to War by Karl Marlantes, a 2011 nonfiction work by Karl Marlantes, a U.S. Marine Corps veteran. He went to the Vietnam War as a young man, as a first, a second lieutenant, then a first lieutenant, decorated variously, and has basically what seems to have happened is afterwards he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. His life was really messed up by it. Sex, drugs, alcohol, um, ending of a marriage, stuff like that. This book is Malantes, as he starts out in the book, he says it's got a couple of purposes. One is to talk to other veterans and to kind of give them kind of insights into how he eventually came to deal with his war experiences. Another one is to prepare young soldiers coming into war. Though he's sort of the opinion of, if you're an 18-year-old dude going into the war, you're probably not going to pick up this book and read it, but that he hopes that the book itself might be an actual influence to the people who will train the young soldiers going in. And third is to people like myself who are like to think of themselves as civic-minded citizens who, in a democracy, we are the ones ultimately who elect the people who decide, let's send these young people to war where they're there to kill people in our name. They're there to exert terrible, terrible force. So while he's using his specific experiences of Vietnam to illustrate that, and indeed a lot of those sections talking about his 18-year-old self having like the full might of the U.S. Army. I'm a Canadian, having the U.S. Army behind him, and saying like, you know what? As an 18-year-old, there were parts of that were like, wow, that is amazing. I got to be an 18-year-old with all that might and force. And he has to say, like, at times, this is not the thing that people want to hear about wars. There were parts of it that were exhilarating, were the greatest high that he's ever had, as well as the super horrific parts of the parts where he indeed came face to face with a person that he killed, that he shot dead, who was going to shoot them dead, and other people that talking about being up in the airplane and just kind of zapping people as he went. But so talking about zapping, see there we get into our kind of video game culture right there of shooting and killing people, of calling in strikes of napalm, where people were burned alive by this horrible, if you don't know about napalm being one of these liquids that it's burning and it sticks to human flesh and it continues to burn. It's like, it's most horrific stuff. But the point of this book being to try and give you an idea of like, what exactly is the cost of violence. I think, coming from, I'm extremely, I'm an extreme example of a civilian who grew up in a household where my grandfather was too young for First World War. My father was too young for the Second World War, and I grew up in Canada, and in the 80s where there wasn't a call for, like, there wasn't that concerted call. I grew up with people who, there were a few people, guys who, I guess guys mostly, who were like, oh, I'm interested in going into the military. And I always kind of looked at them strangely because I always viewed it as one of these things of you get paid terribly. And you don't get a lot of support when you come back. And I even had that conception at the time, as it seemed like quite a thankless job for the amount of rewards you got. But of course, as with the U.S. military, I came from a relatively middle class family where I had a lot more opportunities, where a lot of the people that end up can end up in the military go there because they're going to get opportunities that they can't get because of the thing. Though actually, Marlantes is sort of an interesting case because he's someone who he grew up in Oregon. He was a Rhodes Scholar to the University College at Oxford, and then he volunteered for active duty in the Marines. And he's also somebody who's gone to Yale and Oxford. So he's quite an educated, someone who obviously did have the opportunities, but did have that mindset of, I wanted to be a part of I wanted to be a soldier. I wanted to be somebody who was contributing to the safety of my country, which is an odd thing because our conceptions now of what about the Vietnam War, but of a sort of a service. Is it's an interesting thing in of itself, and it's definitely something where I'm detached from. So it was interesting to read his book to get his point of views on this stuff. But I mean, a big part of his focus in this book is trying to figure out some way of preparing soldiers for war. He sees war. And he does talk about that, like, people don't see war as the answer, but he says he definitely falls on the side of there's going to be times and places where the interests, the necessity will come forward where soldiers are needed in our imperfect world, and that if we're going to train people to do that, we should also train them not just physically but psychologically to try and mitigate the harm. Like we have people coming home, wounded physically, but we have a ton of people coming home also wounded psychologically, which it seems like from his point of view, and I can only take his point of view because I'm not read up on this stuff. I can only go from my own experiences of meeting some veterans at their bottom of being broken psychologically, and that we don't have a what he calls kind of like a warrior ethic. He's very much he comes from kind of a school. He definitely draws on the ideas of someone like Joseph. He talks about Joseph Campbell in this book, and the idea of entering the Temple of Mars is what he calls Mars, being the god of war, and kind of older traditions of the warrior, and that being a way of psychologically preparing the soldier going into battle, and how we don't have that ritual, we don't have that myth anymore. And he does see it. He comes from a point of view of, we're a culture that we tell our stories, even in this very kind of rational society that we have now. We still live on stories. We still live on kind of unconscious myth, whether just kind of that sort of thing. But a lot of modern culture has been about stripping that away. He does sort of drift into what I consider Robert Bly. I'm not quite sure Robert Bly is actually a key part of that, but of kind of men's movement thing where they have problems with feminism, saying, like, instead of having the welcoming queen coming to embrace the soldier, we have a nasty lawyer lady who's going to sue a raging soldier, which I don't think that is a helpful or healthy part of society. I think that quite rightly we're trying to tell women are trying to tell new myths, new ways of thinking about themselves, and that that inevitably means that men have to kind of answer that call of kind of coming up with their own new mythology for that. Which a part of that has to be, which I think I concur with Marlantes in, that is how we deal with violence, how we deal with the aggressive, the anger in our society, and a lot of what we do for that is we suppress it. And I know that for myself because I have a hard time talking about anger. I have a hard time about expressing myself that way without just getting kind of blown out of the situation. And I mean, a lot of the nastier things that we have nowadays, a lot of the wars, which, there's always going to be conflict. That kind of, it's going to be the tensions between genders. There's going to be the tensions between just people, how people feel about things. But we don't seem to have a way at the moment of healthfully channeling that energies of, and that's where I think the book actually kind of expands out. He talks about kind of training soldiers, young people, young men. He's talking about primarily, but I think you can also apply this to young women as well, of channeling kind of that aggression, that anger, of using it thoughtfully. I mean, he's talking about this book, like, there were a lot of, war atrocities are when soldiers basically, well, one of the war atrocities, because there's quite often state sanctioned war atrocities where it's basically it's policy and they ask soldiers to carry that out regardless of what the mental cost to them is. And oftentimes, for a soldier to actually disobey orders is incredibly hard, even in a democratic society, much less in a authoritarian one. But talking about when soldiers go off the script, when they use excessive force, he also includes the idea of like, well, we also have that with police at the moment of such horribly stressful jobs that are known for their terrible burnout rate, for their high rates of alcoholism. We don't think so much about soldiers in that way because they're off doing it to foreign people. And unfortunately, we have enough tribalism still left in the world that we value less when our troops are being crappy to civilians, versus when the police at home are being crappy to our citizens. Even then, of course, we other people, seeing as like what happens with the native population in Canada and black people in the United States, where we just other it. It's like, oh, that's other people. The police wouldn't treat us that way. It's like, we're asking again another kind of, when we're asking police to do this job and to deal with this violence day after day, it has a psychological consequence. And if it's not actually dealt with, if it's not actually dealt with, like whether it's counseling, whether it's he talks about like counseling, he talks about church groups, he talks about kind of basically groups of men of not men. Well, it's very masculine. It's a very, I guess it's sort of hard to avoid that. Oh, me being this, trying to be this gender equality guy. I mean, and that's the thing, is we're actually getting more and more female soldiers, and you get I think about the thumbs up people in the Abu Ghraib, and that was actually, that was both male and female guards. So you get these leakages, these nasty leakages of aggression and of no leadership from the top, and stuff like that, or bad leadership from the top, may as it be, that gushes out there. He goes into a lot of stuff which I think a lot of people will bounce off as kind of new agey, which I don't think is where he's going. I think he's going for a much more concrete, you need to find your own way of dealing with this. And often that, I think, just talking about it with other people in the like situation and just finding a way to process this. But I think, at the end of the day, there's also just sort of an unavoidable thing of, I think, when you talk about what it's like to go to war, is the unavoidable costs, the unavoidable damage that this does to everybody involved, whether you're the victors or you're the defeated. It's like, I would hope that a big part of this book would be just trying to, at least for myself, is to kind of to try and get a little bit more of a, this isn't entertainment. This isn't a video game, or for me, like more like, I use violence as entertainment, whether it's watching movies, whether it's reading a crime novel, whether it's, we use it as entertainment and as something like just to amuse ourselves. Whereas, try to keep that in your mind, that within yourself, that this would, committing an act of violence is to do violence to yourself in a way that is, I think even with the best supports, can be quite horrifying. And he talks about Terry Waits in this book as someone who is like a true, a pacifist, and someone he sounds like he quite respects. That one day, Terry Waits, after we're talking, I think it's years of captivity, was led into a bathroom and just, and the guard waited outside, and somebody had forgotten a machine gun on top of the toilet lid. You can totally see, just put it down, go to the washroom. Then they got back up and left. And Waits talks about I could have picked up that gun and just shot everybody, and shot his guard and escaped and gotten free. And the nightmare, because I think it sounds like a real nightmare, would have been over. But he had spent all this time talking about how violence wasn't the way. So he picked up the gun, walked out, handed the gun to his captor without comment, and back into captivity, back being hooded and tied in a fetal position for days upon end. And it's funny because a story like that makes me think, it's like, well, how much of a pacifist am I? Am I a pacifist? I don't really know. I think I do see areas where violence probably violence is unavoidable, and that might be just my own lack of imagination and my own lack of thing there. But at the same time, I can see, the horrible damage that violence does. And I mean, Terry Waite's in that situation. He's as much a victim of the violence of the world. It's possible he just refused to engage with it in that way. But I mean, I think it's very rare. There's a very small amount of the population that that has got that kind of a strength to it. And I mean, hats off to it. But I think about that situation. I think if I'd been basically tortured for months upon months and held captive and all that violence on me, I probably would have, I can't say that I wouldn't have picked up that gun and tried something, which I guess kind of disqualifies me from the pacifist point of view. I probably would have shot myself because I'm so inept, which is why I'm very happy I live in a country where gun ownership isn't the rule, and you can choose not to have a gun, because I feel for a lot of Americans who seem to come from a point of view of everybody else around me is armed. I just, it's almost like it's overwhelming cultural pressure that way. I'm getting off topic. I'm getting off topic here. So yes, that is what it's like to go to war, which has a lot of things about pacifism in about it, a lot of stuff about anger and violence in it, and trying to a soldier trying to kind of struggle with, is there a better way to be a soldier that isn't going to cause horrible damage to the soldiers that come after me. I don't know if I think Marlantes is talking about minimizing the damage. The damage is still there, which I appreciate, because I think that gives me an inkling of what it's like to go to war. So I value this book on that case. Yeah, and I think more psychological training, psychological debriefing, psychological work with, and by psychological I mean just talking this stuff out, and trying to figure out a way of doing that even within the incident. I know that there's a lot of psychological studies about trauma that it's the faster you actually address stuff, the better. So you don't have someone goes for a tour of duty and is like violence, and then at the very end you start to address it. It's like, no, you have to do it. It would have to be a part of the structure of the army. That still seems like it's a ways away, and we haven't even gotten into the whole idea of people are now so rehooked back into society. It's not like you go away into war and then you can have a little bit of a passage back where you can process things. It's like now people are literally, they go to the office, they operate a drone, and then they come home to their families again. They've been to war in a way. They're inflicting violence, however far from the thing is, and how much that is even more bringing that violence home to the family. So it's a really thoughtful book for a civilian doofus like myself, who lives in a country, Canada, which I'm going to be the first one to say, Canada is completely a part of the U.S. military complex. We are. I mean, whether we're doing operations with the United States, or we just basically benefit from the U.S. might in the rest of the world just by being up here attached to it, or we're a junior member in that, and of course a lot of our industries also feed in those mechanics of war. So peaceful Canada is somewhat of a misnomer. We get to be quiet and we get to benefit from, and we luckily don't have as much of a gun culture, because I do think that's also a part of the violence. But also obviously our entertainment system is basically the U.S. entertainment system, and we feed off of all that violence, all the cop shows, all the war, all the superhero comic movies, all the big entertaining destruction. That feeds into our psychology too. you know, while I kind of poo-poo the whole, people getting desensitized to violence, I read a book like this and say, oh yeah, we are desensitized to violence, and we don't think about how just getting in a fist fight is that kind of a violence would, how much that would impact on somebody. I, of course, have rambled on again for my usual 20 minutes, so I'll leave it at that. That was What It's Like to Go to War by Karl Marlantes. More videos later.